Harlem was already awake when the news settled in, heavy and irreversible. July 1968. The heat clung to Lenox Avenue, but no one moved with it. Black cars lined the street in disciplined rows, their engines silent, their doors closed like sealed mouths. Police stood everywhere, not enforcing, not provoking, simply watching. They understood something had shifted, even if they couldn't explain what it was. 5,000 people gathered, without being summoned. No flyers, no announcements, just word traveling the way it always did in Harlem, faster when it mattered. Hustlers stood beside churchmen. Old women clutched their handbags tighter than usual. Italian suits appeared where they normally never would, dark and expensive, worn by men who avoided photographs and crowds. Today, they showed their faces. Bumpy Johnson was already gone. Yet the street behaved as if he were still watching. There was no shouting, no scrambling for position. The silence did more than noise ever could. It pressed into the chest. It warned people to mind themselves. This wasn't grief alone. It was calculation. Everyone present was measuring what the absence of one man would mean, and whether the city would survive it intact. Whispers moved through the crowd, cautious and deliberate. Not about how he died. Not about who would take his place. The rumor was quieter, and because of that, more dangerous. Bumpy Johnson had left behind words. Not written, not recorded. Words delivered privately, selectively, to men who understood consequences. And those words weren't meant for Harlem. They were meant for the Mafia. No one could say exactly when it happened. Somewhere between his last days and his final breath, a message was passed. No witnesses. No proof. Just a sudden change in posture among men who rarely showed uncertainty. Italian captains stood still, hands folded, eyes forward, as if attending their own trial. They weren't there out of courtesy. They were there out of respect and something closer to obligation. That was the unsettling part. Even in death, Bumpy Johnson was organizing behavior. No one tested the moment. No one pushed forward. No one spoke out of turn. Because whatever had been said before he died had already done its work. It had reached the men who believed themselves untouchable, and it had reminded them of something they preferred to forget. It was the kind of message that doesn't raise its voice, the kind that settles into memory and refuses to leave, the kind that forces powerful men to stand still and listen, because ignoring it would cost more than acknowledging it ever could. Now and in the future. Because what Bumpy Johnson said before he died wasn't a threat. It was a reminder. Long before the funeral, before the silence, before men measured their words more carefully, there was a version of Bumpy Johnson who learned an essential rule early. Fear lasts longer when it's earned quietly. He never relied on spectacle. In Harlem, noise attracted the wrong attention. Intelligence kept you breathing. Men didn't fear crossing Bumpy as much as they feared disappointing him. Crossing him was an action. Disappointment suggested you had been trusted and failed. That kind of mistake carried weight. It lingered. It followed people into rooms they thought were safe. Bumpy understood that psychology mattered more than muscle, and he built his reputation accordingly. He didn't rule Harlem the way outsiders imagined. There were no speeches, no parades of loyalty. He positioned himself as a stabilizing force, someone who absorbed chaos rather than creating it. When disputes erupted, his presence cooled them. When money moved, it moved with purpose. Harlem didn't belong to him, but it functioned better when he was involved. That distinction mattered to the people who lived there. As his influence expanded, his voice grew quieter. Younger men mistook that silence for retreat. Veterans recognized it as refinement. Bumpy listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, sentences were short, precise, and final. He never argued in public. He never chased respect. If someone wanted to underestimate him, he let them. He understood that impatience exposed weakness. Leverage was his true weapon. Bumpy always knew where pressure points existed. Who owed whom, which alliances were fragile, which promises were empty. He rarely acted immediately. He waited. Time revealed more than interrogation ever could. Men eager to prove themselves often destroyed their own positions without being touched. Bumpy simply made room for that to happen. His refusal to beg or posture confused rivals. He didn't plead for territory or recognition. He accepted neither humiliation nor excess praise. Everything was balanced. That balance made him dangerous. People couldn't read him easily, and uncertainty bred caution. In a world driven by ego, restraint became its own form of dominance. That restraint earned him something almost no one else had: respect across lines that were never meant to blur. Italian crime families saw in Bumpy a man who understood structure and boundaries. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't sentimental. When Lucky Luciano entered the picture, it wasn't charity or conquest. It was necessity meeting necessity. Harlem needed protection from outside predators. The Mafia needed stability in a territory they didn't fully control. Their partnership wasn't about friendship. It was about clarity. Luciano recognized that Bumpy governed men who wouldn't submit to outsiders. Bumpy recognized that the Mafia could either be an adversary or a controlled variable. Neither man believed in domination for its own sake. They believed in order. That shared belief kept the peace longer than anyone expected. Bumpy never confused cooperation with submission. He didn't bend. He negotiated. There's a difference, and everyone involved understood it. When disagreements surfaced, they were handled privately, deliberately. No threats. No theatrics. Just an understanding that consequences didn't need announcements. That understanding kept blood off the streets more than fear ever could. Over time, his name stopped needing explanation. People adjusted their behavior before he arrived. Conversations softened. Decisions slowed. Even enemies moderated themselves, knowing escalation would be noticed. That was the measure of his authority. It lived in anticipation, not reaction. Respect followed him because consistency always outlasts fear. In Harlem, that consistency became a kind of law. Men planned their futures around it. They trusted it completely. Order survived because he existed there. Bumpy Johnson never needed to announce power. He didn't wear it loudly or demand acknowledgement. People felt it when he entered a room, and they acted accordingly. That feeling stayed with them long after he left. Time does not announce itself when it turns. It shows up quietly. Through small changes men pretend not to notice. By the mid-1960s, Harlem was no longer the same place Bumpy Johnson had stabilized years earlier. The streets felt faster, louder, less patient. New money moved without discipline. New faces appeared without understanding the rules that had kept them alive. Bumpy noticed, even as he said little. Age had slowed his body, not his awareness. He saw how younger men interpreted silence as absence. They confused restraint for retreat. In their minds, power needed to be visible, aggressive, proven daily. They didn't understand that the very order they took for granted existed because someone had already done the proving. Inside Harlem, tension grew subtle but constant. Old loyalties thinned. Men who once waited for guidance began making decisions on their own, justifying shortcuts as necessity. Meetings happened without consensus. Small violations went uncorrected. What no one admitted openly was that they were testing how much still depended on Bumpy and how much could function without him. Outside Harlem, the structure Bumpy had negotiated with the Mafia was fracturing. The old generation was fading, replaced by ambitious successors who had inherited territory but not wisdom. Agreements made in private rooms years earlier were now questioned by men who hadn't been present when those lines were drawn. They saw Harlem not as a partnership, but as an opportunity overdue for revision. Pressure arrived from another direction as well. Law enforcement had learned patience. Instead of raids and noise, they applied pressure slowly, surgically. Surveillance increased. Informants were cultivated. The goal wasn't arrests alone, but erosion. They wanted people nervous, isolated, unsure who could be trusted. A nervous environment always produces mistakes. Bumpy understood the convergence. He was old enough to recognize patterns repeating themselves. When systems weaken, everyone senses it at once. Some respond with caution, others with greed. What no one knew at the time was how closely he was watching who chose which response. Plans began forming quietly, never announced, never acknowledged. Conversations shifted from loyalty to contingency. Men spoke in hypotheticals. What if someday things changed? What if leadership needed adjustment? What if protection could be guaranteed elsewhere? None of these questions named Bumpy directly. That omission was the signal. His presence was being treated as temporary. The Mafia noticed it too. Fragmentation creates opportunity, and opportunity invites risk. Certain factions believed the old balance no longer served them. They questioned why respect was still paid to a man whose health was failing. They wondered whether Harlem would resist change without his personal gravity holding it together. These questions were never voiced to him. They didn't need to be. Bumpy felt the weight of being the last constant in a system designed to move without pause. He also understood that confronting uncertainty too early only accelerates it. So he did nothing visible. No speeches. No warnings. He let conversations continue. He let assumptions harden. People reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they're unobserved. What made this moment dangerous wasn't hostility. Enemies were predictable. They always announced themselves eventually. The real danger was calculation among allies. Men who smiled, shook hands, and quietly prepared for a future that did not include him. That kind of planning doesn't feel like betrayal at first. It feels practical, reasonable, necessary. But power rarely collapses from attack. It erodes from confidence misplaced, from loyalty treated as tradition instead of obligation, from the belief that stability will survive without the force that created it. As Bumpy's era approached its natural end, the city around him began rehearsing life after his shadow. And the most dangerous moment for a king is never when enemies attack. It's when allies start planning the future without him. That realization settled in quietly, long before anyone dared to acknowledge it aloud. Because stories like this don't get told twice, and some histories disappear on purpose. Subscribe. Bumpy Johnson's body began to fail in ways his mind never did. His heart reminded him of its limits without warning, forcing pauses where there had never been any before. Word traveled faster than truth. In Harlem, health was never private. Weakness, once suspected, became currency. Whispers grew sharper, less respectful, shaped by impatience rather than concern. Meetings started happening without him. At first, they were framed as conveniences. No need to bother him. Let him rest. Decisions could be summarized later. That was how exclusion always began, dressed as courtesy. Those who organized the meetings spoke his name carefully, as if respect alone could substitute for permission. A trusted associate adjusted his posture. Not openly disloyal, just cautious. Commitments softened. Language shifted from certainty to flexibility. He didn't withdraw support. He redistributed it, spreading allegiance thin enough to be reclaimed if necessary. It was survival logic, the kind men used when they believed the clock was running out on someone else's authority. Across town, a Mafia figure reached a similar conclusion. He assumed the problem of Harlem would soon resolve itself. Old agreements were viewed as temporary obligations, binding only as long as the man who enforced them could still walk into a room. Planning began for renegotiation, not conflict, just revision. Power always preferred paperwork to warfare. Harlem felt it. The atmosphere tightened. Conversations lowered. People watched one another more closely. When stability weakens, instinct replaces trust. No one said Bumpy's name in accusation, but everyone sensed the space he was beginning to leave behind, even while he was still alive. What made the moment decisive was that Bumpy knew, not because someone warned him, but because people change when they think you're finished. They rush. They explain too much. They smile longer than necessary. Bumpy watched those patterns the way he always had, quietly cataloging who moved early and who stayed still. He didn't confront anyone. Confrontation would have been reassurance. It would have confirmed that he was still invested in correcting behavior, still willing to argue for relevance. Instead, he allowed the drift to continue. Men who believed themselves clever exposed their impatience. Those who truly understood him waited. When people spoke to him, he listened more than ever. He let them talk themselves into revealing intentions they believed were hidden. Over-explaining became confession. Silence, once shared, now separated the careful from the reckless. Bumpy did not interrupt. He did not correct. He absorbed everything. Anger came and went, controlled and contained. He had lived long enough to understand that emotion, unrestrained, clouds judgment. Loyalty tested under pressure is more valuable than loyalty offered in comfort. The test wasn't whether people would betray him. It was how, and how quickly. At moments, it seemed he might speak. A sentence would form, then be withheld. Those near him felt the weight of what remained unsaid. They mistook restraint for indecision. That misunderstanding protected him. It allowed events to unfold naturally, without interference. This was the edge of his authority, where presence alone was no longer enough. Correcting assumptions would have restored order temporarily. Defending his position would have invited negotiation. Bumpy chose neither. He understood that true control did not depend on his body occupying space. He had seen this moment before in others. Powerful men clinging to relevance, demanding reassurance, trading dignity for another season of influence. He refused that ending. If his time was closing, it would close on his terms, not theirs. The city believed it was waiting him out. Men convinced themselves they were being patient, when in reality they were being exposed. Every delay clarified intention. Every silence sharpened contrast. Loyalty revealed itself through restraint, not proximity, and Bumpy noticed every detail. This knowledge hardened him further, not with bitterness, but with resolve born from experience. Somewhere between those quiet observations and the tightening of his health, he made a decision. Not to reassert himself, not to remind anyone of past consequences, but to leave behind something more durable than reputation. It was deliberate, controlled, and shaped to outlast sentiment, fear, or memory. He would not clarify his intentions. He would not name disloyalty. He would not force loyalty through fear. Instead, he prepared a response that required no supervision, something that would guide behavior after his voice was gone. The men around him never noticed the shift. They believed the deadline applied only to him. They did not realize they were being measured one last time, not by strength or proximity, but by instinct. What Bumpy was shaping in that silence was not an ending. It was a condition, one that would remain in place long after his absence became permanent, and long before anyone understood what he had truly left behind. Bumpy Johnson prepared the way he had lived, deliberately, without witnesses who could misunderstand him. There were no dramatic gatherings, no final lectures disguised as wisdom. He understood that speeches invite interpretation, and interpretation invites argument. What he intended to leave behind had to survive without clarification, without his name attached in ink. So nothing was written down. No letters, no recordings. Paper could be stolen. Words on tape could be denied, distorted, or weaponized by people who did not understand their weight. Bumpy chose the older method, the one trusted by men who knew how power truly moved. He spoke privately, once, to those who needed to hear it, and never again. Each message was delivered indirectly, passed through relationships already thick with history. No single messenger carried the whole truth. No one could trace it back to a single moment. What he left behind wasn't a plan. Plans create ambition. It wasn't an order. Orders invite resistance. And it certainly wasn't a threat. Threats require enforcement, and enforcement requires presence. Bumpy was preparing for absence. His words established boundaries, not commands. Lines that existed whether anyone acknowledged them or not. The men who received the message understood immediately, not because it was explained to them, but because it fit perfectly into what they already knew about him. It reminded them of debts settled and debts that would never be forgiven. It clarified what behavior would be tolerated and what would quietly collapse under its own weight. Nothing needed to be acted on immediately. That was the point. The Mafia grasped it first. They were accustomed to force, to hierarchy enforced through consequence. This was different. It offered no opportunity for challenge. There was nothing to confront, only a choice: operate within the boundaries or destabilize arrangements that had protected everyone involved for decades. Stability was more profitable than ego. They adjusted without complaint. What made the response effective was its invisibility. No one announced compliance. No new leaders were crowned. Yet, behavior shifted. Meetings slowed. Ambitious moves were postponed. Men who had been eager to test limits suddenly found reasons to wait. Bumpy controlled outcomes without issuing a single directive. That kind of dominance cannot be argued with, because it doesn't argue back. After his absence, restraint became the default. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. Crossing those boundaries wouldn't result in immediate retaliation. It would result in isolation. Partnerships would thin. Protection would evaporate. The system he built would simply stop responding. For men who relied on structure, silence was the harshest penalty available. Harlem felt the stability even as it mourned. There was no rush to claim his position. No sudden spike in violence. The streets sensed something holding it in place, unseen but firm. That was his final control. Order without oversight. Balance without enforcement. A system that punished recklessness by removing opportunity rather than spilling blood. Those who had underestimated him realized too late that nothing had been left unfinished. The absence of chaos was the confirmation. His influence did not rush forward. It settled. Men adjusted their ambitions downward without being told. The environment itself enforced restraint, as if remembering him were enough to keep everyone in line. No reminders were required after that. His death came without ceremony. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. No gunshots. No sirens. No public reckoning. A heart gave out in a restaurant, among ordinary people who didn't understand the magnitude of what had just ended. News traveled quietly, carried by voices that lowered instinctively. There was no soundtrack, no final image of defiance, just a space left behind where a man had been. And in that space, behavior adjusted. The city held its breath, then continued, altered but intact. Bumpy Johnson left the world the same way he had governed it, in silence. Harlem, days after Bumpy Johnson's quiet passing, was a city holding its breath. Lenox Avenue carried the weight of absence as 5,000 people gathered without instruction, without protest, without ceremony. They came because the man who had walked among them, protected them, and ordered their world without spectacle had left a void that demanded recognition. It was a gathering measured not by grief alone, but by respect, by comprehension of what it meant to lose a presence that had quietly governed so much. Italian mob captains appeared where they never otherwise would. Not for show, not for alliance. They arrived because Bumpy had reminded them, silently, irreversibly, of the limits no man should cross. His final words had not instructed them to act, nor did they threaten reprisal. They were boundaries, clear and unspoken, that defined what behavior was acceptable in his absence. The Mafia understood immediately, because the reminder carried a weight heavier than any gun or contract. Debts had been paid, respect had been earned, and lines existed that were not to be tested. Within Harlem, younger men and ambitious operators held back. Meetings slowed, schemes were postponed, and the streets themselves seemed to acknowledge a new, invisible authority. The city operated on instinct, on memory, on fear and reverence combined. No one spoke louder than necessary. No one moved faster than prudence allowed. In every measured step, the echo of Bumpy Johnson's presence remained. The funeral procession itself became a public statement. Flowers were arranged, carriages lined the streets, voices whispered prayers, but the spectacle was secondary. The true reckoning was in behavior, in the absence of chaos, in the unspoken understanding that order survived because a man had existed to instill it. Every salute, Every bowed head, every quiet glance between former rivals reinforced what no one dared articulate aloud. Authority need not shout to dominate. Influence does not require life. The gathering also clarified loyalty. Allies who had wavered in private now stood in public solidarity, not for optics, but because the boundaries set before death demanded it. Ambition without respect would no longer succeed. Men who had tested limits realized that the cost of overreach extended beyond fear. It reached to survival and opportunity itself. Bumpy had not given commands. He had shaped the framework within which power continued to operate. In that collective silence, the city understood something essential. The most powerful legacies are not enforced through spectacle or violence, but through the lasting effect of presence. The funeral confirmed what had been prepared in silence. Order persisted, respect endured, and the unspoken rules held fast. And in the quiet aftermath, as crowds dispersed and the street returned to its measured rhythm, one truth became clear. When a man dies and order remains, that was never luck. After Bumpy Johnson's death, his name did not fade. It grew. Stories circulated of his calm decisiveness, of the streets that remained orderly without his presence, of the Mafia who measured their own actions against a standard he had set silently. Reputation, he had always known, is not built in public approval, but in the behavior it compels. Long after the crowds dispersed from his funeral, men acted as if he were still watching, not because they feared discovery, but because they respected the lines he had drawn. No one stepped forward to fill his place. Ambition slowed at the edge of his absence. New operators discovered that the systems he had shaped could not be claimed or commandeered. Power without understanding crumbles quickly. Authority without precedent is fragile. Bumpy had left both. His influence persisted not in speeches or displays, but in structure, in expectations, in the subtle weight of order. Those who tried to step forward found themselves constrained not by his threats, but by the environment he had quietly molded. Modern power players often misunderstand what it takes to endure. Noise can gain attention. Violence can command obedience. But longevity requires patience, clarity, and restraint. Loud men are remembered briefly. Quick displays of dominance fade when the spectacle ends. Quiet men, by contrast, are obeyed long after they are gone, because their presence reshapes the behavior of others in ways that outlast life itself. Bumpy Johnson's legacy was never about fear alone. It was about intelligence, discipline, and the capacity to orchestrate influence without announcing it. He demonstrated that true authority needs no performance. Respect, loyalty, and order follow naturally when they are earned, not demanded. And so Harlem, and the underworld beyond it, remained changed. Men still whispered his name. Streets still moved according to rules only he had codified. And those who understood the lesson carried it forward, knowing the measure of power is not the noise one makes in life, but the silence one leaves behind. Quiet men, Bumpy had proven, outlive chaos. Their authority survives death. Their legacy becomes law.